I still remember the day the letter arrived, not in an email, not by phone, but in a crisp ivory envelope tucked neatly between a stack of junk mail and a local political flyer. My son had always been formal, the kind of boy who believed in clean lines and carefully chosen words. But nothing could have prepared me for what I read. Don't try coming to the family reunion. You're not welcome anymore. This is what we've all agreed on. Let it be. Signed in the same handwriting I used to guide through cursive workbooks, the same pen stroke I once watched scribble shaky love notes to girls in middle school. No mom, no signature, just a cold declaration of absence. I didn't cry, not right away. Instead, I stared at that single sheet of thick, weighted paper as if it were a verdict. In a way, it was a ruling from a court I didn't know had convened, in a trial where I hadn't even been invited to testify. The irony? I was the one who had built the courtroom, the family, the foundation that allowed my son, my own blood, to stand so comfortably above me now and say, "You're no longer part of us." I texted back just one word, "Understood," not because I agreed, not because I forgave, but because I knew something they had forgotten. I remembered everything, the sacrifices, the debt I took on when my husband died unexpectedly, the small house I worked 3 jobs to keep from foreclosure, the car that ran on prayer and engine tape, the holidays I made magical on single-digit budgets, the birthday parties that looked effortless because I stayed up all night cutting decorations by hand. And yet, somehow, I had become the villain in their version of our story. The distance between me and my children hadn't always been this vast. There was a time when they clung to my legs at daycare drop-off, when their first heartbreaks ended with their heads buried in my lap. But things began to change slowly, almost imperceptibly, after my husband's death. At first, it was just small things, decisions made without asking, missed calls that turned into weeks of silence, invitations where I was expected to pay, but never included in planning. Then came the subtle jabs. "You wouldn't understand, Mom, it's different now. I mean, no offense, but you've never really fit in with the way we do things. We're building something new, something more refined." The language of exclusion always arrives dressed as progress. But I knew the truth. I wasn't being left behind. I was being erased. It started, as most things do, with money. When my husband died, I didn't inherit much, not in the traditional sense. We weren't wealthy, but we had built something steady. A house fully paid off, a retirement account we'd sacrificed for, and a small collection of stock options he had protected like gold. I invested quietly, learned, grew what he left behind into something bigger, safer. I never told the kids how much. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't want money to become the axis of our bond. But they found out, eventually, and everything shifted. Suddenly, I was no longer mom or grandma. I was an asset, a potential, a threat if uncooperative. They never said it outright, of course. They didn't have to. It was in the tone of their requests, the urgency in their voices when they talked about renovations, second mortgages, investment opportunities. Always followed by, "We're not asking for much." It was always just enough to test how far I'd bend. And for a while, I did bend. I helped with down payments, co-signed a loan or 2, paid for medical expenses they didn't want their spouses to know about. I justified it all in the name of love. This is what mothers do, I told myself. We give, even when we are tired, even when they forget to say thank you. But love, real love, is never conditional on compliance. What I didn't realize until much later was that my silence, my kindness, my willingness to keep giving had taught them to see me as weak, disposable, background noise in the louder, shinier version of their adult lives. And one of them, or all of them, had finally said out loud what they'd all been circling around for years. "Don't come. You're not part of this anymore." The family I had sacrificed everything for had closed its gates. And as I folded that letter and slid it back into the envelope, I realized something I hadn't dared admit for a long time. They weren't mine anymore. Not the way I remembered them, not the way I had hoped they'd grow. They had become people I didn't recognize, and I had become someone they thought they could discard. But what they didn't know, what they never imagined, was that I had spent years preparing for the moment love turned its back on me. I had built, quietly and thoroughly, every investment, every account, every decision after my husband's death had been deliberate. I had endured betrayal once before when cancer took him from me. I swore I wouldn't endure a second from my own blood. They had exiled me from their version of family, but they had no idea what kind of mother they had just cast aside. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was distraught or heartbroken, though I'd be lying if I said those emotions didn't claw at my chest, but because something far colder, far more dangerous was settling into place inside me. Clarity. For the first time in years, I saw everything for what it truly was. The cracks hadn't appeared overnight. This rupture didn't begin with that letter, it had only ended there. The truth was, my children had been drifting away from me for years, and like any mother, I had made excuses. I blamed busy lives, demanding jobs, growing families. I told myself their distance was circumstantial, not emotional. But now, with this letter in hand, I saw it differently. The pattern was always there. I had 3 children, 2 sons, 1 daughter. My eldest, Andrew, was the one who had sent the letter, the leader, the orchestrator. He was the most articulate, the most successful on paper, a financial advisor who wore confidence like armor and spent holidays managing everyone else's schedule like a corporate event. He didn't ask about my life, he asked for outcomes. "What's your net worth, Mom?" he once asked bluntly over Thanksgiving dinner, after his 3rd glass of wine. Just curious. Then there was Hannah, my daughter. She had once been my confidante, the one who cried in my arms after her divorce, the one who used to send me voice notes at midnight about her dreams, her loneliness, her triumphs. But somewhere along the line, her affection turned performative. She smiled in front of friends, called on Mother's Day with her kids on speakerphone, but I could feel it like air thinning. The warmth was gone. She never visited without Andrew. Never stayed long, always left early, citing traffic or emergencies that never seemed urgent. And then there was Luke, my youngest, sweet, sensitive, impressionable. He had always hovered between loyalty and longing for his siblings' approval, for a sense of belonging. He followed their lead more often than his own heart. When they began pulling away, he followed suit, not out of malice, but weakness, the kind that allows good people to let bad things happen, simply because they're too afraid to speak up. They weren't evil, but they were entitled to my time, my energy, my silence, and I had fed that entitlement with my own hands. After my husband died, they expected me to collapse, to play the role of the soft, sorrowful widow whose life revolved around theirs. They never imagined that I would rebuild, quietly, without fanfare, that I would take what little we had and turn it into something formidable. I didn't win the lottery. I didn't invest in the next tech unicorn. I simply made smart, consistent choices over time, property in the right markets, conservative portfolios, small business shares that matured well. And eventually, I had more than they ever assumed. They only found out 3 years ago, after I had a mild health scare. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to justify reviewing my affairs. I made the mistake of being transparent. I told them I had reorganized my estate, established a living trust, and had spoken with a financial advisor to ensure long-term protections. I even mentioned, in passing, the amount in my retirement account just once, just offhand, but it was enough. From that moment on, the relationship changed. Phone calls increased, but only with financial questions. Checks arrived, but rarely without a request. "Can you help with this? Can we talk about reallocating some things for tax benefits? Have you thought about liquidating one of your properties to simplify management?" They couched it all in concern, framed their questions as caretaking. But I knew they weren't interested in me. They were interested in what I represented. An unlocked door, a waiting vault, a resource. I played along for a time, hoping it was temporary, that they'd come to their senses, that maybe I was just being cynical. But then came the conversations, always led by Andrew, about consolidating generational wealth, about redefining estate roles and streamlining family decision-making. And when I pushed back, gently but firmly, I saw it, the first flicker of resentment. He thought he could charm me, convince me, reason with me. But when that didn't work, he grew cold. Accused me of being outdated. "You are not thinking like a modern family," he snapped during one dinner, wine glass slamming too hard on the granite countertop. "You are just hoarding. Dad would be ashamed." That was the moment the line was crossed. He invoked his father, my late husband, as a weapon. And I realized then, this was never about security. It was about control. The reunion invitation, or rather, the lack of one, was simply the final confirmation that they had decided, collectively, that my refusal to hand over my autonomy was a betrayal they would not forgive. So they exiled me. They made it official. And I accepted their decision, but not with submission, with strategy, because I knew something they did not. I had already rewritten my will, not in rage, not in haste, but in clarity. And they were not in it. Not $1, not one property, not one artifact of the legacy I had spent my life protecting. They had chosen erasure, and I would give it to them completely. The real unraveling didn't begin with the letter. It began 2 years earlier, during what should have been an ordinary Sunday brunch. Back then, I still attended family gatherings, still hosted birthdays, and made casseroles that went untouched in favor of overpriced takeout. We had met at Andrew's house. His wife Julia greeted me with her usual brittle smile, the kind that never quite touched her eyes. The kids were running around, their names blending in my head like echoes from a house I was no longer allowed to enter fully. I had brought a hand-knitted sweater for my youngest granddaughter. It was soft, pale blue, with tiny daisies embroidered along the sleeves. I'd spent a week making it, stitch by careful stitch, but when I handed it to her, Julia intercepted it before the little girl could reach. "Oh," she said with a chirpy voice, turning the sweater over in her hands. "That's sweet, but she only wears organic cotton now. Her skin's very sensitive." She set the sweater on a side table like something mildly contaminated. I said nothing, not because I didn't want to scream, but because I was already too used to this new language of dismissal. The way they made you feel small without ever raising their voices. The way your years of love and effort could be so casually edited out, rewritten by the new rules of their curated world. Later that day, Andrew approached me with a glass of wine and the kind of false intimacy reserved for someone trying to close a deal. "We should talk soon," he said. "About the future, about the estate." I blinked. "What about it?" He gave a small laugh, like I had asked something naive. "It's just with the grandkids and everything, it might make more sense to consolidate. Maybe let one of us, me or Hannah, step in and start handling things proactively. It's too much for you, Mom. You shouldn't be doing it all on your own." That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about help. It was about access. I looked him in the eye and said, "I'm still quite capable of managing what your father and I built. But thank you for the concern." The mask cracked for a fraction of a second, just enough to reveal the resentment hiding underneath the polished civility. Andrew didn't like being told no. He never had. That day marked a shift. After that brunch, the invitations became more sparse. When they did arrive, they came with caveats: "We already ordered food, so don't bring anything or just come for dessert, no need to stay long." I became a guest in my own family, expected to arrive quietly, contribute silently, and leave without notice. Even Hannah, my once closest child, began parroting Andrew's language. "I just think it's fair if the family works together on these decisions," she told me one afternoon after dropping off her kids. "You've done so much, but it's time to start transitioning responsibility." I looked at her and asked, responsibility for what? Her lips pressed thin. "For the legacy, for what's left." They were already speaking as if I were gone, as if I were a ghost walking through my own lineage. Luke said the least, but his silence hurt more than their words. He stopped coming by entirely, stopped calling. I saw him only at birthdays or holidays, where he kept his head low and offered side hugs like obligations. I once pulled him aside after Christmas and asked gently, "Have I done something to hurt you?" He looked at me, eyes wide with discomfort, and whispered, "It's just better if we all stay aligned right now. Please don't make this harder." I realized then they had chosen each other over me, and none of them were brave enough to say it directly, so they said it through distance, through exclusion, through bureaucracy masquerading as concern. And every time I resisted, every time I declined to reorganize the trust or refused to reconsider reallocating assets, I became more of a problem. They didn't just want me to comply. They wanted me to willingly surrender, to sign over the life I had built in the name of family unity. But I knew what that meant. It meant turning the keys over to people who saw me not as a person, but as a legacy bottleneck, an obstacle, a keeper of doors they wanted unlocked. And when I wouldn't hand over the keys, they decided to lock me out entirely. The tension built like static in every room we shared. Conversations were clipped. Hugs became perfunctory. They stopped asking about my health, my hobbies, my friends. Every interaction was centered around what I could provide, what I would allow, what I was still holding on to. Until finally, Andrew took it one step further. He showed up at my house unannounced, portfolio binder in hand, and said we needed to review the numbers. I let him in, sat him down, made tea I knew he wouldn't drink. He flipped through projections, trust revisions, tax advantages, all of it dressed in financial jargon that I recognized for what it truly was, a hostile takeover, softened by spreadsheets. When he was done, he said, "It just makes sense, Mom. You don't need all of this." I closed the folder, looked him in the eye, and said, "And you don't get to decide what I need." That was the moment I saw it in his face. The decision, not a spark of rage, not even disappointment, just calculation, as if he'd finally reached the end of his patience and chosen the path he had long been planning. I didn't know then that the reunion was already being organized without me, or that my name had already been removed from family group chats, or that Julia had told people I was mentally slipping. But I would know soon, because 3 months later, the letter arrived, and my son made their betrayal official. After Andrew's visit, something inside me calcified. Not bitterness, not yet, but a kind of sharpened awareness. A quiet vow I didn't speak aloud. No more explaining. No more proving myself to people who had already decided I didn't count. I began to observe everything from a new distance, like I'd been forced out of a story I had spent my life writing and was now watching it be rewritten in real time by the very children I'd raised. Their next move wasn't subtle. 2 weeks after the uninvited financial review, I received a letter from a law office. It was professionally worded, wrapped in polite phrasing, but I saw the core of it immediately. They were trying to remove me as trustee of my own estate. Andrew and Hannah had retained a lawyer and were arguing that mental fatigue and emotional volatility made me unfit to continue managing the trust. They cited erratic communication, withdrawal from family activities, and reluctance to share financial information. In essence, they were building a case to have me declared a liability. I stood in my kitchen, reading that letter while the tea kettle whined in the background, and felt a rage I hadn't tasted since my husband's funeral when the insurance agent questioned whether I had known about his heart condition. That same flavor of insult layered over grief. But this was worse, because this came from my own children. And still, I said nothing. I didn't confront them. I didn't call. I didn't argue. Instead, I hired my own lawyer, not to fight them, to outmaneuver them. I knew if I responded emotionally, it would feed their narrative, the declining matriarch resisting change, the fragile mother clinging to the past. They wanted me reactive, so I chose to be strategic. My attorney and I revised the estate documents, solidifying protections, strengthening successor clauses, and, most importantly, rewriting the trust in a way that removed my children as primary heirs. I left provisions for the grandchildren direct, airtight, and court-proof, but Andrew, Hannah, and Luke, they were formally excluded. It wasn't a rash decision. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it out of self-respect. They had made it clear I was no longer part of the family. I was an obstacle to their collective ambitions, so I decided to remove myself completely on my own terms. The second betrayal came from Hannah. She arrived one afternoon, unannounced, with pastries in a box and concern painted too thickly across her face. She sat on the couch, legs crossed like a therapist, and began her performance. "Mom, I just wanted to check on you. You've been distant, and the kids miss you." I asked, "Which kids?" She blinked. "What? Which of your children asked to see me?" I name. "Recently." Silence. She changed the subject. "I just think we're all worried. You've been keeping to yourself. Andrew says a lot." I interrupted. Her jaw tightened. "You don't have to make this harder than it is." "What is this exactly?" "The transition," she said, her voice quiet. "Letting go of some of the responsibilities. Handing off some control. It's what Dad would have wanted." I almost laughed. "Don't speak for your father," I said. "He's the only one in this family who never tried to take something from me." She stood up quickly, red-faced, muttering something about trying her best. But before she left, she looked at me, really looked, and I saw it. The coldness. The same look Andrew had worn. Calculating. Disappointed. But above all, entitled. That was the last time she came to my house. From then on, the campaign intensified. I was slowly removed from family photos on social media. Birthday party invitations didn't arrive. When I dropped off gifts, they were never acknowledged. At first, I thought Luke might reach out quietly, maybe, but even he disappeared behind their wall of unity. I became the unspoken shame, a ghost in a family I had once built with my bare hands. The pain was real, but so was the clarity. They had chosen legacy over love, wealth over wisdom, and in doing so, they lost the very thing they thought they were claiming. I wasn't going to fight them in court. I wasn't going to beg them to see my value. But I was going to make sure that the next chapter of my life, the one they tried to erase, would be written on my terms. I began putting things in motion. Quietly, intentionally. I met with a trust specialist, converted one of my properties into a rental that would generate income for community housing projects, established scholarships for women over 50 returning to school after widowhood. I made my wealth invisible to the outside world, but indestructible in function. And I prepared my final act. Because I knew something they didn't. You don't get to exile a mother and expect her to leave empty-handed. You don't get to sever a bond and keep the inheritance that came from it. You don't get to rewrite a legacy while the original author is still very much alive. There comes a moment when grief evolves into purpose, not because the pain is gone, but because clarity demands movement. That moment came for me the morning I stood in my late husband's old study, the soft hum of the air purifier filling the silence, and opened the black binder labeled Family Legacy. It had been untouched since the year of his death, a time capsule of financial reports, estate plans, handwritten notes, and letters of intent. Charles had been meticulous, a man who planned for probabilities others preferred to ignore. He left no detail to chance, and buried within those pages, I found my way forward. Not revenge, reclamation. I spent the next 6 weeks executing decisions I'd previously only drafted in fear, unsure if the time was right. Now I knew the time was past due. The first thing I did was contact the trust administrator and initiate a quiet restructuring. Most of our assets, stocks, properties, holdings had been placed in revocable trusts years ago, with my children listed as contingent beneficiaries. I revoked every one of them, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. They had made it abundantly clear they believed I existed to fund their lives, not to be part of them. I reallocated every asset into 3 new subtrusts. The first, a philanthropic fund in Charles's name, with disbursements dedicated to housing, education, and medical support for single mothers over 50 women like me whom society forgets. The second, a legacy grant for community entrepreneurship seed money awarded anonymously to local initiatives started by women, reviewed biannually by a small advisory board I personally appointed. And the third, most carefully constructed trust, one for the grandchildren, not their parents. Only them, but with strict controls. No early inheritance. No access via their guardians. Every dollar would be released only upon completing a major personal milestone, graduation, military service, opening a small business, publishing a book, or earning a trade certification. Each disbursement required a personal letter written to me or Charles, reflecting on what they'd learned. Not money for existing, money for becoming. At the same time, I met with my estate attorney to update the final will. No sentimental loopholes, no half measures. I made it irrevocably clear that my children Andrew, Hannah, and Luke were to receive nothing. Not the houses, not the residuals, not even the heirlooms. I donated Charles's watch collection to the local museum, his cufflinks to the Historical Society, his books to the university library where he lectured in his early career. Then I began preparing for the one final act that would make it all impossible to ignore, the family reunion. Even after the letter, they had gone forward with their plans. I knew the date, the venue, the guest list. It had always been my tradition to organize it. They simply assumed I would slink into the background while they carried it forward. They hadn't removed me from everything, of course. Just from them. Some distant cousins still reached out. Charles's brother still sent me cards. They weren't in the inner circle, but they knew enough. I didn't want to attend. I wanted to make a statement, and I knew exactly how. 3 days before the reunion, I sent individual letters to every elder member of the extended family, Charles's surviving cousins, his retired uncles, the matriarch who had known him since childhood. In each envelope, I included 3 things: a personal message in my handwriting, recalling a memory they'd shared with Charles, a notarized copy of the new estate structure with clear annotations, a short note: I thought you should know who was truly invited and who no longer is. The response was swift. Dozens of phone calls, some with tears, some with fury, some with long silences followed by, I had no idea. They had assumed I was ill, that I had stepped back by choice. Andrew had told them I was taking time for myself. Hannah had said I was traveling. Luke had said I wasn't comfortable being around crowds anymore. Lies. Lies wrapped in empathy. But now the truth stood sharp and irrefutable. They hadn't protected me. They had removed me. And now, the wider family knew it. The morning of the reunion, I didn't pace the floor or dwell in nostalgia. I didn't even dress for the occasion. I wore what I always wore on weekends: gray linen pants, a navy sweater, and my husband's watch, which I'd reclaimed from the museum 2 days earlier under the clause that I could retain any item not yet exhibited. He'd always told me, wear this if you ever need reminding that you still own the time they think they control. By noon, I was in my car, parked 2 blocks from the event hall where the family had gathered. The banquet center was tasteful but hollow, all polished marble and cold chandeliers. I watched from a distance as relatives trickled in, some I hadn't seen in years, some I'd cradled as infants. Andrew stood out front with a practiced grin, greeting everyone like a statesman, taking credit for a family built on the bones of my labor. Hannah adjusted the seating chart with a clipboard tucked under her arm, the same one I'd once gifted her during her brief attempt at event planning. Luke, as always, lingered near the drinks table, visibly nervous but too complicit to stop anything. They thought they'd won, that the narrative was theirs to sculpt, and my absence meant silence. But silence, I had learned, is not surrender. Sometimes, it's preparation. At precisely 2:15 p.m., every adult in that banquet hall received a notification on their phone. A single text. Simple, direct. I may not have been invited, but I still have a voice. Please check your email now. Seconds later, inboxes across the room lit up with an encrypted file titled Legacy and Truth. The first page was a letter from me, not angry, not accusatory, just factual. It detailed how I had been deliberately excluded from the reunion, how my estate had been targeted and my autonomy questioned, how years of service and sacrifice had been dismissed as inconvenient. I wrote of my love for the family, the real family, not just the children I birthed, but the legacy I upheld and the values Charles and I built into every generational brick. I did not plead, I simply documented. The second page was a full breakdown of the estate's restructuring, how none of my 3 children would inherit a single cent, and why. The names of the grandchildren, the charitable causes, the protections, all notarized, all legally binding, and all delivered into the hands of the very people Andrew, Hannah, and Luke had expected to sway with charm and curated stories. By 2:45, I had over a dozen missed calls. By 3, Julia's mother posted a confused comment on Facebook about the shocking turn of events at the Keene gathering. By 4, I received a text from Luke. "What did you do?" I didn't answer, because it wasn't what I had done, it was what they had done. I just showed the truth. But there was one final move I had saved for the crescendo. You see, Charles had left a video recording before he died. It wasn't long, just 7 minutes. A message to the family. We had agreed to save it for a moment when it was truly needed. In the final moments of the reunion, the video was emailed to the event organizer's public display system. I knew the password. I had paid the AV technician weeks in advance. The lights dimmed, and there he was, Charles, in his chair, eyes tired but blazing. If you're watching this, it means something's gone wrong. And if that something involves greed, manipulation, or betrayal, then let me remind you, our legacy was built on respect. Not blood, not titles, not access. If you cannot treat your mother with the dignity she earned with every sacrifice she made to raise you, then you do not deserve her name, or mine. Silence followed, deep and reverent. Then the lights came back up, and one by one, chairs were left empty. Some relatives left early, some whispered apologies. Some simply walked out and didn't return. Andrew's face, I was told, turned a shade of gray no designer suit could conceal. Hannah wept not from shame, but from exposure. Luke disappeared into the parking lot and didn't come back. Me, I drove home, windows down, music on, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I felt undeniably present, in control, whole. They had cut me off from the family, so I reminded them what the family actually was, and who built it from nothing. What my children didn't understand, what they never truly grasped, was that I had been preparing for this longer than they had even been planning it. Because while they had been chasing prestige, flaunting curated family photos, and leveraging our name for influence, I had been building quiet alliances. With lawyers, with estate managers, with old friends whose reputations couldn't be bought, with people who remembered who I had been before widowhood, before motherhood, before my life was swallowed up by their demands. Now, those connections would become my scalpel. The fallout from the reunion was immediate. The next week, Andrew lost a prospective client, one of his firm's biggest whales, after they received an anonymous tip linking him to unethical attempts to interfere with a family trust. The client had grown up poor, worked his way up. Loyalty to family was everything to him. He couldn't stomach the idea of a man trying to force his mother off her own estate. The anonymous tip? A carefully timed letter, signed with a pseudonym that I had used during the early days of our real estate portfolio. Something only Charles would have remembered. A detail no one would be able to trace back to me unless they knew. Then came the audit. One of the nonprofits Andrew funneled consulting money through received notice of a tax inquiry. Someone had flagged inconsistencies. Nothing illegal, but irregular enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to put pressure, and while the inquiry didn't end in prosecution, it did end in exposure. His name was printed just once in a local paper. That alone was enough for rumors to swirl in circles that cared more about perception than truth. His reputation didn't crumble overnight, but it eroded piece by piece. And he knew where it started. Hannah, meanwhile, relied heavily on her social capital. She'd become a well-polished mother of 3 in an affluent suburb, book clubs, church boards, school fundraisers. Her currency was image. Her comfort came from the illusion of being part of the good family. But word travels fast in tight communities, especially when whispered through the right mouths. I began donating discreetly, generously to the PTA of her children's school, not under my name, but through the Charles Keene Community Fund. With each donation came a note thanking the school for fostering ethical values and promoting intergenerational respect. Eventually, my name emerged at the donors' brunch. One of the board members asked if I'd like to speak at an upcoming event on maternal leadership and legacy. The email was CC'd to all contributors, including Hannah. She never replied, but she withdrew from the planning committee 3 days later. Then came Luke. Sweet, foolish Luke. He didn't deserve a hard fall, but he had aligned himself with the ones who built the wall. And sometimes, standing silently beside betrayal is no different than swinging the blade. He'd recently started a small business with Andrew's seed funding a tech-adjacent startup too fragile to withstand turbulence. I didn't attack the business. I didn't sabotage it. I simply withdrew my support. He had asked me, months ago, if I could introduce him to a few angel investors I knew through Charles's early years in software. I had smiled, nodded, and kept the names tucked away. Now, when the startup began bleeding funds, Luke reached out through email, voicemail, even a handwritten card. I read them, but I didn't answer, because choices have consequences. They had chosen to remove me from their narrative. Now they were experiencing what it meant to be written out of mine. Still, it wasn't enough to simply strip them of comfort and privilege. Revenge without revelation is hollow. I wanted them to see it, to understand not just what they lost, but why. So I published a memoir, privately, quietly, for limited distribution. It wasn't salacious. No names, no scandals, just a chronicle of a woman who raised a family, built a legacy, suffered betrayal, and chose power over pity. A story of transformation not from mother to matriarch, but from resource to reckoning. I sent bound copies to every library and women's shelter in the county. I donated a stack to universities, bookstores, foundations, and in every copy, I left a single note taped to the inside front cover. They tried to make me disappear, so I became unforgettable instead. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the softest turn of a lock, the quietest withdrawal of a hand, the moment someone reaches for power they assumed was theirs only to find it gone. That's what I gave my children. Not fury, not violence, but absence. Total, strategic, permanent. Once the memoir circulated, the dominoes truly began to fall. I never published it under my full name. The cover simply read, "By a mother who refused to vanish." But people talk, and families gossip. The title was enough to start speculation. The writing was precise, the tone unmistakably mine. Anyone who had known me, even briefly, could read between the lines. Soon, my phone began to ring not from my children, but from their orbit. Old friends, distant relatives, former neighbors who hadn't seen me at the reunion and assumed I was unwell. I had no idea. They whispered, "I'm so sorry, Maureen. Is it true?" I didn't confirm. I didn't deny. I just thanked them for reading. But what mattered more than sympathy was what followed. Doors began to close on my children. Polite smiles began to flatten. Invitations dried up. The curated version of our family, the image they had built on top of my real foundation, began to crack. At a country club gala 2 months later, Andrew was passed over for a board position he'd been maneuvering toward for years. The committee didn't explain why, but one of the wives, who had attended my quiet reading event at the Women's Center, told another woman at a luncheon that Andrew had lost the confidence of legacy. Just 5 words, enough to stick. Hannah attempted to organize a charity benefit for one of her usual causes, environmental awareness, something surface level, but safe. But this time, major donors pulled out. One board member emailed her privately, saying, "Until your family's issues are clarified, we feel it's best to pause collaboration." She tried to explain. She blamed misinterpretations. But no one wanted a scandal, especially one involving disinheritance. Luke's business floundered. When his investors realized Andrew was under soft scrutiny from financial circles, they backed out preemptively. His cash flow dried up. He reached out to me again. A voice memo. Desperate, tired. "Mom, I know we handled things badly. I know I made mistakes. But I'm asking for help. Not money, just your advice, your guidance. Please. I don't even know who I am without this." I listened to it 3 times. And then I deleted it. Because sometimes the deepest wound isn't what you take away. It's the moment they realize they burned the only bridge they'll never rebuild. And I wasn't done yet. There was one final legacy left to claim my name. The Keene family name had carried quiet influence in our region for over 4 decades. Charles had built it through mentorships, philanthropy, personal sacrifice. I had maintained it with grace, discretion, and resolve. Now my children wore it like armor, using it to enter rooms they hadn't earned. So I reclaimed it. I reached out to the foundations we had funded over the years, scholarships, community grants, charitable institutions, and submitted formal requests to remove Andrew, Hannah, and Luke's names from all acknowledgments. I included the new legal documentation outlining my updated estate and trust designations. Most complied without hesitation. A few even thanked me for clarifying. Where their names had once stood on plaques and commemorative walls, a new engraving appeared, in honor of Maureen and Charles Keene and the values they protected with unshakable resolve. That inscription was unveiled at the grand opening of a literacy center Charles and I had pledged funding toward before his passing. I attended, quietly, sat in the back, but when the director read aloud the dedication and the crowd stood in applause, I felt it like a tide rising inside me. This is what legacy truly means. Not the passing down of money, not family dinners built on guilt, but the passing on of values that refuse to die even when forgotten. I walked out of that building into the late afternoon light, no longer waiting for acknowledgement. Not craving an apology, just breathing, free. I hadn't destroyed my children. They'd done that on their own. All I had done was remove the cushion of my loyalty and let them feel the floor for the first time. The days that followed weren't filled with victory laps or champagne toasts. No, real closure doesn't come with confetti. It comes quietly in the stillness of your home when you realize you no longer flinch at the sound of a message alert. It comes when you wake up and there's no anxiety under your ribs. Just breathe, just space. For the first time in years, I reclaimed my mornings. I started walking again early, before the world rushed to fill the silence. My neighborhood had always been quiet, but now I noticed things I hadn't in years. The way the sun stretched across the pavement like spilled honey, how the scent of jasmine lingered outside the florist's gate, how the newspaper boy waved with the same crooked smile Charles used to have on Sundays. My world was still intact, but my universe had shifted, and I was no longer orbiting around people who only saw me as a resource. I began saying no more freely, not just to my children, but to everything that once made me feel like I had to earn my space in this world. I stopped attending events out of obligation, stopped over-explaining my decisions, stopped cushioning my strength with soft apologies, and in that vacuum, something remarkable happened. New people stepped forward, women I had once volunteered with, women from the charity boards, neighbors who had always admired how I kept my lawn in bloom. Even during the hardest winters, they reached out, not because they wanted something, but because they had seen what I'd endured. Some had watched in silence, some had suspected the dynamic long ago, but hadn't known how to approach it. Now they came with warmth, with respect, and with shared stories. One woman, Vivian, a retired therapist, invited me to speak at a support group for older women facing familial estrangement. I nearly said no, but she said something that caught in my chest. We're not gathering to share pain, Maureen. We're gathering to remember we're more than what our children choose to see. That room changed me. 23 women. Different races, religions, income brackets, but the same story told in different voices. Sons who manipulated, daughters who weaponized kindness, spouses who allowed it. All of them blamed themselves until the day they realized they weren't broken, they were simply outgrown by people unwilling to grow alongside them. I told them my story, not the revenge, not the estate, the real story. The loneliness, the doubt, the years I spent wondering if my sacrifices had made me invisible, and how, finally, I stopped asking for acknowledgement and started building from the ashes. When I finished, an older woman named Lillian squeezed my hand and said, "They didn't throw you out, Maureen. You walked away with everything." And she was right. Even without their love, I still had mine. For myself, for my integrity, for the legacy that outlasted their cruelty. And that legacy unexpectedly found its way back to me through the people I thought I had lost completely. It started with a letter, written in pencil, folded 3 times. No return address. It was from my granddaughter. "Dear Grandma, I know Mom says we shouldn't talk to you, but I don't think that's fair. I remember how you used to make me banana bread and let me help even when I made a mess. I miss you. Are you mad at us? Love, Zoe." I cried harder over that note than I had when Charles died, because it wasn't just a child missing her grandmother. It was a spark of resistance, a chance for truth. I didn't respond directly, not yet. I consulted with my attorney first, established a private communication pathway that couldn't be intercepted, sent back a small package, a blank journal, a pen with her name engraved, and a note that said, "You never have to choose sides. Just write me your story." 2 weeks later, I received the first entry, then another, and another. Soon, her younger brother joined in. Then Hannah's oldest, curious, careful, scared. They were finding their own way, and I wasn't going to force them to run. I would wait, I would listen, and I would be there when they arrived, because that's what real legacy looks like. It's not what you leave in your will, it's what you leave in someone's heart when they realize the truth on their own. The winter after everything settled was the first season in nearly a decade where I didn't feel like I was waiting for approval, for permission, for someone to call. My home, once echoing with strained phone conversations and the hollow sound of unanswered texts, began to breathe again. I filled it with music. I roof-holstered the old armchairs Charles and I used to sit in, not because they were falling apart, but because I wanted the fabric to match who I was now, bold, unyielding, full of fire. I planted lavender along the front walkway. I adopted an elderly dog named Bishop from the shelter. He limped, snored loudly, and had a habit of growling at people who stood too tall near me. I liked him instantly. Like me, he had seen too much, trusted too many, and yet still wagged his tail when the morning sun came through the window. My days no longer revolved around keeping the peace in a war I didn't start. I began volunteering at the women's center that had hosted my first reading, not as a guest, but as a mentor. Once a week, I sat with women, some young, some my age, who had stories that mirrored mine in fragments. Mothers disrespected by their children, wives abandoned after decades of sacrifice, professionals dismissed the moment they became inconvenient. I didn't give them answers. I gave them space. I listened. I told the truth, and the truth, when spoken plainly, becomes a map for those still lost. I wrote another book, not a memoir this time, but a guide, Inheritance Without Guilt, How to Guard What You Built Without Losing Who You Are. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't have to be. It landed exactly where it needed to, in the hands of women who had been told their value expired when they stopped giving. Some wrote to me. One woman, a retired nurse from Michigan, sent me a letter that read, "I thought I was crazy for not putting my children in my will after they screamed at me for not paying their debts. Reading your words reminded me I'm not cruel and careful. Thank you for giving me permission." I cried when I read that, not because I was sad, but because I knew I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just healing. I was helping others rebuild from the same rubble I once sat in. As spring came, I traveled, alone, purposefully. I returned to the city where Charles and I met. I stood on the university steps where he first offered me a ride home in the rain. I visited the diner where we had our first coffee. I walked those same streets not as a ghost of the past, but as a survivor of what came after. One afternoon in a hotel lounge in Chicago, I met a retired judge named Evelyn. She was sharp as glass and twice as dangerous. Over bourbon and jazz music, she told me her children hadn't spoken to her since she sold the family lake house without asking them. I told them I'd rather have my peace than their approval, she said, lighting a cigarette she never actually smoked. They didn't like that. We became friends instantly. Over the next few months, I met more women like Evelyn, women who had been written out of their own lives by the people they raised. We began gathering once a month. We called ourselves the Second Act Society. No tears, no apologies, just plans, power, laughter. By the end of that year, I was no longer just living. I was thriving. And yet, in the quietest hours, I still thought of my children. I didn't hate them. That was never the point. I grieved them, grieved the people they could have been, the versions of them who might have stood beside me, not in front of me, demanding keys to something they didn't build. But I no longer needed them to make me whole. One final thing happened that spring. A box arrived at my door. No return label. Inside, I found the sweater I had knit for my granddaughter years ago, the one Julia had rejected. Folded perfectly. Clean. Preserved. Beneath it, a card written in soft, uncertain handwriting. Asterisk Grandma. I found this in Mom's closet. She never let me wear it, but I always loved it. I know what happened now. I'm older. I see it. I hope you'll wait for me. I don't want to be like them. Asterisk, it was signed, Zoe. And that was the final thread stitched back into place. They thought erasing me would preserve their version of the family. Instead, I became the only one they couldn't forget, because I didn't beg to be included. I built a life that didn't require their permission, and in doing so, I became free.